Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm Dr. Robert Childs. In June of 2021, the Adirondack Park Agency celebrates its 50th anniversary. Brad Edmondson tells the story of how that agency was created in his brand new book, A Wild Idea. I talked with Brad about the book and about all of the research that he put into this in a recent event for the Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs.
If you can get into the personalities of the people who created the thing and also illuminate their conflicts and their motivations and how they interacted with each other, you can bring that stuff to life. And then you slip in the important, boring stuff in the process of telling the story.
I'm really gratified that Brad asked me to join him tonight to talk to him about this splendid book, which if you haven't yet gotten it, make sure you get it from Northshire, because it's an absolutely marvelous read, and I think we'll dive right into it. The process, first of all, of the book is impressive, and it paid great dividends in the rich story that you're able to tell throughout the book. You talked to, I think it was over 6 people. You talked to all of these interviews over many, many years and invested time and energy and probably soul into this project. What were some things along the way that surprised you the most as you were undertaking this?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Well, you're absolutely right. This project actually started as an oral history project where I was given some assistance to go interview people with long-form taped interviews that they would end up revising and then would be checked into an archive. So the original idea was not so much to write a book, but to get all of these people on tape before they left the planet. And then I ended up with all of this great material. And I'm a journalist, and I just couldn't resist. I just couldn't stay away from it. Because it's a crazy story, and there were several things that just left my jaw on the floor when I learned them. And I'll just tell you about two of them. One is how informal life was at the Adirondack Park Agency when it started. The APA in 1971, when it was first getting the land use plan together, was more like a small tech startup than a state agency. People were working around the clock. They were sort of ignoring their families. They were completely absorbed in the mission. And the thing that I couldn't really believe is that there was a refrigerator in the back of the building that was stocked with beer. And it was, the director of the APA bought the beer. And there were rules about when you could drink beer and when you couldn't drink beer, but the sort of informal rules. But people basically kept going, working after 5 and on weekends. by hitting the beer cooler. And if you think about working as a employee of New York State now versus that kind of environment, it just shows you how different life was in 1971. So that was one of the things. Another thing that I thought was really interesting, and I think I still have more to learn about this, was the sort of cultural practice of what you might call revenge arson. There was an interview that I did with an early APA director, Dick Persico, who there had been an episode where an APA commissioner's barn in the 1990s had been burned down anonymously. And this was at a time of great tension between local people and the APA. And the director of the APA was really upset about it. And a local guy who worked for the APA said that this practice was known as red balling. And that the idea was that if somebody really ticked you off and you needed to get back at them, you would burn their barn down, or you'd do some sort of thing. And the interesting thing about that was that it goes back to 1908, when the large private estates were first being roped off and patrolled by private game commissioners in the Adirondacks, and local people no longer had access to traditional sort of fishing and hunting spots because they were not only private property, they were also being patrolled, and trespassers were being prosecuted. They set fires in those estates as an act of revenge. And that theme of watch out or I'll burn it down kind of surfaces. It comes up and down throughout the story.
Well, it's interesting. As you were telling the story, not only did you speak to a lot of people to be able to tell the story, but you also tell us about a lot of them. We really get to know many of these characters, some of them incredibly famous, some of them are Rockefellers, but others are very obscure characters. Is there anybody, both from your interview experiences and from this broader narrative, who sort of jumps out and as folks here are reading the book, you want them to really remember or focus in on somebody they should know from this story, or somebody that just having interacted with them, you think we ought to know about more?
Yeah, that's a great question, Robin. I think there are several. I actually, the idea of making this a character-driven story was quite intentional. My niche as a journalist is really writing about topics that most people consider really dull. And one time I gave a speech, when I was covering another field, I gave a speech, and afterwards a lady came up to me and said, "Thank you, that was not nearly as boring as I thought it was going to be." And this is basically a book about land use planning and a state agency that enforces a land use plan and how that came to be. And that does not sound very interesting. But if you can get into the personalities of the people who created the thing and also illuminate their conflicts and their motivations and how they interacted with each other, you can bring that stuff to life, and then you slip in the important, boring stuff in the process of telling the story. And so the whole story really, in a sense, it revolves around two people, neither of whom are very well known, but both of whom deserve to be. One is this state bureaucrat named Harold Jerry, who was the staff director of the Temporary Study Commission on the Future of the Adirondacks. And Harold Jerry was, he had degrees from Princeton and Harvard Law School, but he was from Plattsburgh. And what he really liked to do was to go up to his camp outside of Speculator and check his trap lines and skin beavers. So he sort of lived in both worlds, and he was a hardcore defender of a wild Adirondacks and extremely limited development. Rockefeller put him in the position of directing the staff, not being one of the commissioners, but directing the staff. And he very skillfully manipulated the commissioners and directed the staff so that the commission produced a report that essentially said that the forever wild doctrine in the Adirondacks should be strengthened and that there should be more wild land rather than less. So he's one of the guys. The other is a man you might call Harold Jerry's protege, George Davis. Harold Jerry hired George when he was a graduate student at Cornell. He had just arrived after 6 years as a U.S. forest ranger. He'd been at Cornell less than a month. But it just so happened that the thing that he had enrolled at Cornell to study was exactly what Harold Jerry needed studied for the Temporary Study Commission. So Harold Jerry picked him up and brought him to Albany, and he worked to produce the report. And then he became essentially the driving force of the early Adirondack Park Agency. And this map that's behind me, the private land plan, is really a product of George Davis's imagination. You might almost say that this is the PhD thesis that George Davis never wrote. And George was extremely bright, extremely hardworking, and committed not only to preserving wilderness in the Adirondacks, but also to the principles of the plan. And so he got it across the finish line in this very elegant, very complicated plan. But like a lot of people who have that sort of mindset, George was not very good with politics, and he was not very good with accommodating people who disagreed with him or talking to people who disagreed with him. So as an outgrowth of that individual's personality, the Adirondack Park Agency really didn't do a good job at all of selling itself to the people who lived in the Adirondacks. And George, there was a big personal toll on George for this work that he did. So he's a fascinating character.
That is fascinating. I think most people wish that their PhD thesis would be as influential as this.
Or they could be paid as well as George was to write it. You know?
That's true as well. It was a long process for them, as you point out, and it also, as you suggest, it tapped into broad, ongoing national debates about land use and about what it meant to be a conservationist, what it meant to take care of government lands. Of course, this goes back, as everybody here knows, to the 1890s in New York State with the Adirondacks. But you also talk about this national debate, right? The sort of Gifford Pinchot school. A lot of people in those forestry schools would have been, and you suggest were, antagonistic toward what these guys were proposing. And is that what you mean, or what do you mean, I guess, is sort of a leading question, when you say that this was a wild idea?
Yeah, well, you're right. You can trace it back a long way. Gifford Pinchot was the first director of the United States Forest Service, and he came up with the idea of what he called sustainable yield, which was basically the idea of a working forest. You cut a set amount of timber every year, and you cut enough to make a profit, but you leave enough in the ground so that it regenerates by itself, and the forest becomes healthier by that metric in terms of being able to produce more timber for sale. So that's Pinchot's version, is basically the forest is a natural resource that produces timber, wildlife, water, and other things for people to use. The other side of the debate, and this is a debate within conservation. It's people who basically, everybody loves open space in this debate. But on the other side of the debate is a person who some people would say John Muir. I would say Aldo Leopold, the author of A Sand County Almanac, who was also a forester. And Leopold was, one of the things he was very well known for saying was that a thing is right when it is the way that it was created. And if it's not the way that it was naturally created, it's no longer right. And that Leopold really popularized the idea of protecting biodiversity. And this was back in the 40s. This was really a fringe idea at that time. The conflict on the Temporary Study Commission, which really was resolved by the time the APA was created, was between these two doctrines. The idea of the Adirondack Forest Preserve being a resource for people to use to not only to produce timber, but also to produce recreation. And then people who wanted forever wild, the clause that prohibits cutting on state-owned land in the forest preserve is called the forever wild clause. And the people who were devoted to that and to the idea of untouched wilderness, the forever wild people really won. And but they had to overcome a lot of powerful opposition in order to do that, starting with the governor's brother, Lawrence Rockefeller, who really put up quite a fight in favor of turning the Adirondacks into what would look like a traditional national park. So that's one of the big stories in the book that I think is new.
And the way that you tell that story, I think, is one of the many great contributions here. It seems that you sort of trace a shift in the power balance. It seems like there's a time in the 1950s and into the early 60s, maybe, when we're going to use some of this, but we'll be sustainable, like Pinchot said, and so we'll make it work. And by some point in the mid 1960s, it seems like the balance has shifted so that conflict that you chart within the temporary study is resolved in favor of the wilderness idea. Are there key moments that stand out to you in your story, or key figures, and maybe you've named some of them already, who account for that change?
Yeah, really, a good way of looking at that argument between those two factions and how it was settled in front of what you might call the hardcore environmentalists in the 60s is really to look at the national rise of the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club was sort of a regionally based California hiking organization that did get into environmental fights, but was pretty much based in California in 1960. And then the director at that time, David Brower, decided to fight this proposal to put dams in the Grand Canyon. He got a tremendous amount of publicity, and his membership went nuts. And he really either caught the beginning of a wave, or he helped create a wave of public concern that was building about pollution in general and environmental impact in general in the 60s. But Brower was really one of the people who broadened that public concern over the health of the earth to the preservation of open space. And the Sierra Club got started in the East in the early 60s as a very small group of people based in New York City. But it too grew very rapidly until by 1970, the Sierra Club and several other organizations had created this very, very well-oiled lobbying machine and had this enormous amount of public support because people were really worried about pollution and environmental impact in the late 1960s. So politically, the Forever Wild crew, who had really been at it since the 1920s, had their moment in the late 1960s. And they even had an official coming out party on Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970, just a year before the APA Act was passed, when, one of the little funny moments in the story is Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who knew that the environment was how he was going to get reelected in 1970, to demonstrate his concern for the earth, he wrote a non-polluting vehicle in Brooklyn, which you and I would call a bicycle. And there are all of these pictures of the governor of New York riding around on a bicycle, just to prove that he loved the earth.
It seems that I really like how you tie what's going on in the Adirondacks to those national trends, because it really is true. And we see it later in the book as well, maybe in a less helpful way for the APA once they're created. But it also, in your New York story, it seems that 1967 is a big turning point year, both because of constitutional debates and the Northway's progress. Is that sort of a regional turning point, and then the national trends coalesce with it?
Yeah, absolutely. The Northways the Northway is Interstate 87 from Albany to Montreal. And it was opened in the summer of 1967, drastically reducing the amount of time that it took to drive from New York, Philadelphia, and Boston to the Adirondacks. And everyone who was concerned with the health of the park and impact on the park knew that visitation to the Adirondacks, which had been increasing anyway, was going to really go up sharply after the Northway opened. In fact, it did. The idea of something having to be done in connection with the Northway was really because, as probably most of you who are on this call know, the Adirondack Park is a mixture of public and private land. Most of the Adirondack Park is in fact privately owned land, and most of that privately owned land is large working forests owned in the 70s, owned by timber and pulp companies. In the late 60s, there were virtually no rules about what you could do on that privately owned land. There was no zoning. And that was also a time when developers, some of them really quite unscrupulous, were coming out with plans in vacation spots like Vermont, Florida, Arizona, and so forth, to carve up large parcels of open space and carve them into house lots and sell the house lots to people who dreamed of a second home in a scenic area, and then bug out, not build any roads, not provide any infrastructure, take advantage of these small towns that didn't have any planning and get out. That was happening in the Adirondacks. And so those large second home developments on private land were really the thing that pushed the land use plan for the APA over the finish line. People did not want those to happen. But they also didn't have the money to buy the private land. And that's why the private land plan was passed.
Well, you pointed out a moment ago that there had been folks lobbying for this, clamoring for something like this since the 1920s, and I appreciated the way that you tied. You didn't ever get sort of off track, right? And you stayed in your story, but you would tie it back to the deeper history. I think everybody loves a couple of good Al Smith references thrown in, which were successfully deployed, and so I was happy about that.
I can't wait to read your book, actually.
Well, it worked very nicely, and you pointed out how long this idea had been something people had been pushing for. But to tie it back to the process for a moment, I mean, you worked on this for a long time yourself, the book, and as you said, it started as an oral history project, and over time became a book. I'm curious, what made you as an author stick with this particular project so long? What drew you into it and kept you going?
Well, believe me, I've often asked myself the same question. The oral history component really started in 2002 and went until 2007 or 2008. And I really wasn't, I thought as I got further into it, what I realized was two things. One was, these people I'm talking to are great storytellers. I mean, they're really good storytellers in this collection of interviews. I started with a man who a lot of people who love the Adirondacks already know of, Clarence Petty, who was this legendary forest ranger, died at the age of 105, and he's a major character in the book. Clarence was just a wonderful guy to get to know. And by the time I finished talking to him, after 10, 12 hours of tape, I really wanted to know more. And so I just kept going. And I was very rarely disappointed. There were very few interviews where the person was just really dull, because it's pretty interesting material when you talk about it on the human level. The other thing that really kept me going, though, was that I was hired by someone who had been the Atlantic chapter president of the Sierra Club, and he was interested in getting the stories of the people who started the APA, the activists and the officials who had actually passed the law. And so I talked to all those people, but as I got further into it, I got more and more interested in the people who lived in the Adirondacks and how they reacted to the law and their objections to the law. And I realized that virtually every scrap of paper relating to the Temporary Study Commission and the Adirondack Park Agency's creation has been saved and is exquisitely well curated in a variety of archives. But there was virtually nothing about the opposition to the APA. And the people who led it were, like the environmentalists, getting older and older. So I saw a sort of pressing documentary need to capture the stories of the opponents and to present their side sympathetically before it was too late. And so that's really what kept me going. I put the whole thing away for 8 or 9 years after I was done with oral histories, and then got back to it and was very pleasantly surprised when the Adirondack Museum got really excited because it would help them observe the 50th anniversary of the APA, which is just coming up later this month, actually. So that's why it took such a long time.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the forthcoming anniversary, which first of all is I think everyone has till June 25th, right, which is the day Rockefeller signed it. So you all have until June 25th to read through this, and the exam will be that day. But I think that I think that backing up to another 50th anniversary, which happened a bit earlier in our year, January, right, was the Temporary Study Commission's report being released, and that presented the model legislation, which would lead to what you were just describing, and it also led to all sorts of, well, they had already had hearings, but it leads to more hearings. And I'm interested, some of the stories that come through in this book about the different attitudes that are presented in different parts of the state. And you just hinted at it, right? The opposition sometimes gets overlooked. What's the geography of this, and what were people's reactions to the Temporary Study Commission and to the proposed legislation, especially within the Adirondacks? Some of these meetings in school gymnasiums, you tell these really rich stories about people leaving the room to go vote for the school board and then come back in and hopping back and forth. Tell us about that, because I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, well, the people who lived in the park, they really didn't have a chance. There are probably 110,000 to 130,000 permanent residents of the Adirondack Park at any given point in time over the last 50 years. And there are 19 million people in New York State. And the support for open space, for strong open space protection and strengthening the Forever Wild Clause statewide, it has really been very, very strong since the 1890s and has never really wavered. People who live in big cities, even if they don't visit the Adirondack open space, they like the idea that it's there and they want it to be protected. And so the opposition was really small, and it was restricted really to rural areas and very conservative areas, and it was strongest just inside the North Country. But this minority who were basically ignored, they didn't go quietly, and they really started organizing protests that in a way reflected their powerlessness, but were also pretty effective because they used humor to register their opposition to what was going on. This is not in the book because it happened later after the APA had been around for a few years. But one night, a couple of people who in Lake Placid who didn't like the APA had a pickup truck with a hydraulic bed, and they loaded it up with horse manure, and they dumped the horse manure on the front steps of the APA building in the middle of the night with a sign on it that said, "We've taken yours for years, now here's some of ours." And they didn't have any money and they didn't have numbers, but there were several people in the oppositional movement who had this gift for political gestures that was just brilliant. And people still talk about that pile of horse manure on the APA steps. And I was really fascinated by that because it's really about, how marginalized groups struggle for representation using whatever tools they have in place. So yeah, the hearings were really pretty lively, and some of them got pretty close to being riots. But at the same time, the people who were running the APA always knew that they had the votes, and the people that they needed to impress lived in Albany.
Well, when the APA itself was passed and signed, how closely did that act resemble the temporary study commission's model legislation? Anyway.
It was pretty close.
Yeah.
It was pretty close. The temporary study commission is. I gave it a lot of ink and spent a lot of time on it because, unlike a lot of sort of blue ribbon panels or state commissions, generally the reports of those commissions don't produce very much of lasting value. This one was really, really impactful, and it had it made 181 recommendations for the Adirondack Park. The Adirondack Park Agency, and they were ranked, and number one, the most important recommendation, was the creation of the Adirondack Park Agency. That was the only one that passed the year the report came out in 1971. More of them passed in 1972, but then several of the things that were recommended many of the things that were recommended by the Temporary Study Commission were passed piecemeal or sort of worked into policy slowly over the next 2 decades, so that if you read those recommendations now, it's a really visionary document that really introduces a lot of ideas in open space protection and conservation that are really taken for granted today. And this was one of the first places that those ideas ever appeared. So yeah, it was pretty close.
It's interesting because you say in the book that the vast majority of the energy on behalf of this is coming from outside the Adirondacks. Majority of the people within the Adirondacks are opposed but powerless, and they remain opposed, as you point out, right? The manure story you just relayed was, I think you said, in the 90s, and you're talking about before the barn burning and the red balling and so forth. And yet you also point out in the book that the majority of people living within the park boundaries, these people who are so fiercely opposed, weren't affected by the private land plan when it first was passed in 1973, right? So why are they burning things down? Why are they dropping manure? Like, what is this antagonism? Is there more to the story?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big questions that I really wanted to find out the answer to, and why I wrote the book. And the answer's pretty interesting, I think. I think maybe rather than saying the majority of people who lived in the park were opposed to the agency, I think that's probably true. But the structure of the political way, the way people came down who lived in the park was kind of like maybe 20% thought that the regulations were a good idea and supported them. And maybe 20 or 30% were infuriated by them. And maybe a small subset of that 20% worked hard to stop them. And the vast majority of the people who lived in the park just kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, okay, here we go again. And I think that you can find this sort of attitude in any area where the economy depends on tourism, and particularly people from away coming to a scenic area for brief periods to spend lots of money and then leaving again when the weather gets bad, which has been the story in the Adirondacks for 150 years. And so people who live in the Adirondacks frequently, the only reason they're able to scrape together a living in the Adirondacks is because of tourists and summer homeowners who employ them in various ways. And so the seasonal residents and the visitors are recognized as necessary. But to park residents, they're sort of the tourists are sort of seen as a natural resource. They're the source of wealth. But the people who live in the park full time, even though they don't own the land, they feel a sort of ownership of it because it's the land that's all around them all the time. So they become resentful when people from away tell them that they're not doing a good job and the land needs to be saved. And, we're going to propose this big regulatory scheme in order to save this land. The reaction of the locals to that idea is we're not doing such a bad job here. So I think even though very few people were personally affected by the law, very little economic value was actually taken away from park residents by this law. It was insulting. And it was part of an insult that people felt that had gone back over 100 years.
What's interesting too, first of all, the way that you capture that within the book is really effective. And so you really get a sense that you, as an author, as a historian, as a journalist, appreciate the vision of the people coming up with this plan, but you also, as you say, are you're not dismissive at all of those who feel like they're getting sort of ramrodded here by outsiders, and they've been for a century or more. So I think that's very effectively presented. Perhaps another layer of irony is that just at the moment the wild idea triumphs, the world that you were talking about before and that you described very well in the book, the sort of moment that it allowed that is evaporating. You write that the optimistic era that created the APA ended almost as soon as the agency was born.
Yeah, that's really true.
And tell us what that meant at the time and what it has meant ever since.
Well, that's a really important thing it's a very important turning point in American history. Was 1973, and the APA private land plan was passed in May of 1973, and I think it was that the debate on the law opened in the New York State Legislature the same day that the Watergate hearings began in Washington. And in another life, I covered public opinion polling and demographic trends. And if you look at the trend line for people who are polled and are asked the question, I'm paraphrasing here, but the question is, do you trust the federal government to do the right thing? In the early 60s, close to 3/4 of the American population said, yes, I trust the federal government to do the right thing. And then because of the war in Vietnam and a number of other factors in the late 60s, that confidence in federal and governmental authority started to erode. And then when the Watergate hearings opened, it just went off the cliff. And for the last couple decades, when you ask people that question, fewer than 1 in 5 Americans will say that they trust the federal government to do the right thing. So the Watergate was a very important turning point because it was the loss of trust in government to provide solutions to social problems. And so that's one reason. The other reason, of course, is that the APA law passed because of the political muscle of Nelson Rockefeller, who was probably the most powerful governor in the history of New York State. And a few weeks after the law passed, Rockefeller privately told his staff that, well, actually, I'm speculating, but Spiro Agnew was indicted and faced impeachment on a separate matter, a non-Watergate matter, and that story broke in July or August of 1973. And just 5 days after Rockefeller heard that story, he told his staff that he was going to quit being governor of New York in order to run for president for the fourth time. Rockefeller wanted to be president of the United States more than anything. And when Agnew was no longer the heir apparent to Richard Nixon, Rockefeller saw his opening. So he quit. He walked away. He basically left the APA in its crib. And the APA was really underfunded for several years, early years of its existence. So it really was trying to do this very difficult, very controversial task with inadequate funding and inadequate personnel and very little support at the top.
Well, and as you point out in the book, things were, as you say, people don't trust the government anymore. Rockefeller's not there pushing it anymore. And the budget is a mess all of a sudden, right? All of a sudden, we don't have the money to do the big things that maybe, and so it all comes together to thwart it. It's interesting, I'll just say in passing, because I know we have limited time, that the way that you sort of mingle the history of the Adirondack Park Agency with Rockefeller's various ambitions, right? In 1968, it's going to be helpful for his liberal credentials as a Republican. And then in 1970, it's going to help him get reelected. And then he doesn't need it, so he gives them a delay. And then here it sort of dies, not dies, but it suffers of neglect. And so it's interesting how big a role he plays.
Oh, it wouldn't have happened without him. I mean, he was absolutely critical to the whole thing coming together. And the thing you missed there, which is, I think, one of the most interesting things, is his love for his brother, Lawrence. Yeah. Lawrence Rockefeller was not a guy who liked the spotlight, but he was a really important figure in the history of conservation in the United States. And he really wanted the Adirondacks to be saved. So part of Nelson Rockefeller's motivation was getting reelected and pleasing, he was a Republican in a state where Democrats outnumbered Republicans in registration by a substantial margin. And he had to carry New York City. So in order to get elected, so he had to have a strong environmental record politically, but he also had to have a strong environmental record so that when he had dinner with his brother, he wouldn't get, yelled at so much. And they were very fond of each other. Nelson and Lawrence were really best friends for their whole lives.
Oh, I love the way that we really get to know Lawrence pretty well in this book, and I appreciated that as well. I'll ask briefly more about methodology. Talk about your sort of, you did a lot of interviews, but there's also a lot of archival sources. What are sort of the collections that you found most essential to this story, and tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is a little bit of, you might find this a little bit of inside baseball unless you like to do the research yourself. But really, if you're interested in the history of the Adirondacks, the Vatican for that topic is the Adirondack Experience Museum in Blue Mountain Lake, which is, if you've never been there, it's just, it's a really remarkable place. It was endowed and opened and built by the chairman of the Temporary Study Commission, Harold Hochschild. And Hochschild was a really interesting figure for lots and lots of reasons. But he was also passionately devoted to Adirondack history, very wealthy, and a lot of his fortune went into this regional history museum, which for a place out in the middle, the Blue Mountain Lake has a population of maybe 200 or 300 people. And this is one of the best regional history museums in the country. And the archive there is just outstanding. So if you want to know about the Adirondacks, you've got to go to that place. There's also a great resource in the village of Niskayuna, run by Union College, called the Adirondack Research Center, that is sort of the early environmental organizations, by which I mean the early 20th century environmental organizations. When it was time for them to dissolve and find a repository for their records, they built an addition onto the house of their leader, Paul Schaefer, who lived in this beautiful house in Niskayuna, and that became the archive. And that is also a very small but very important collection of material on Adirondack environmental history. And then, of course, the mother of them all is the organization you and I both have such close ties to, the New York State Education Center, which is the museum, the archives, and the library. It's likely to be there. If you're interested in finding it, and it has to do with the history of New York, it's likely to be there somewhere. Finding it is sometimes a bit of a challenge, but it is an absolutely massive collection of material on all topics. And that's also a very important place to look for the history of the Adirondacks. And there are others too, but those are the big three.
Yeah, and delightfully, the library and the archives share a reading room and really helpful staff. It looks like we have time. Maybe one quick last question. It just struck me. I forgot to ask you about the Schenectady Mafia. So if anybody's intrigued by that, pick up the book. So I'll just ask you very briefly, what didn't you find that you're still curious about in this project? You spent a lot of time on it. What are your unanswered questions?
Yeah, that's that. So yeah, there were a couple of people who got away. There was a guy, the state senator who represented most of the Adirondacks. It's a guy named Ron Stafford. Nothing passed having to do with the Adirondack Park unless Ron Stafford either approved of it or stood aside and let it happen. And Ron essentially stood aside and let these laws happen, even though his constituents were some of the most hardcore opponents of the Adirondack Park Agency. And I think it's pretty clear that Ron was protecting his own career in Albany and his access to Governor Rockefeller and also future governors by letting the APA survive and being deferential to it and not trying to burn it down. But I really wish that I'd talked to Ron Stafford. I did talk to him on the phone, but he was very ill by the time I reached him, and we never had an interview. His motivation and how he balanced his personal beliefs against political expediency is something I really would have liked to include in more depth and couldn't. And then the other thing, which is, also maybe a little bit far into the weeds, but it's another one of these topics that it seems pretty dull until you start uncovering the human stories, is the use of conservation easements to protect large parcels of open space. This was one of the things that the Temporary Study Commission recommended be used in 1971. And it was, everybody was like, what is that? What is a conservation easement? Nobody knew what that was. And it took 13 or 14 years for the legislation to be sorted out so that people could actually sell their development rights and protect a scenic area in perpetuity while still maintaining ownership of it. And now that's an absolutely essential tool in conservation. There's enough land under conservation easements in the United States to cover a territory, I think, as large as the state of Pennsylvania. And there's a large drive now in the climate control movement, the climate change control movement, to protect intact forests and to keep them from being developed, and to in fact grow forests, make forests bigger because they're such effective in capturing carbon. Easements are going to be absolutely critical in this, which is absolutely critical in this pressing environmental movement. So the growth and sorting out an early use of conservation easements in the Adirondacks is something that I am now working on, and hopefully will write another book on, in a couple of years.
Well, when you do, I hope I'll get to talk to you about it. I'll just wrap up my portion here by thanking Rachel and Northshire at Saratoga, and you, Brad, for letting me be a part of this, and encouraging everyone to purchase A Wild Idea.
Thanks, Rob.
From our friends at Cornell Press, whom we also adore. And thank you, Brad, and I'm sure that the audience has a lot.
Thanks very much, Rob. Great questions.